beginning. But otherwise, this session is really aimed at people maybe in buildings, but you might be somebody who uses a building but doesn't necessarily own a building, so it should be relevant to everybody. And we're working with Culture for Climate Scotland because they have such, excuse me, such an extensive background in working on adaptation. And Scotland, as you've mentioned, the last session, is really a world leader when it comes to climate adaptation. We think it's kind of a crucial issue that sometimes gets a little bit overlooked when we're so absorbed with the whole issue of climate change itself. And maybe just to say that this is a very sort of, it's very topical at the moment, the whole issue of climate change and climate adaptation. We've got COP30 starting on Monday, and it's kind of ironic that a lot of people are obviously going to take long haul flights from the West to go and attend COP in Brazil, but there you go. And interestingly, next year, Ireland will have the presidency of the EU. So it will be Micheál Martin who will lead out on the COP negotiations on behalf of the EU next year. So there will be a big focus on us next year going into those COP negotiations. So that's basically it. I'm just going to pass you over to Cara, but I just want to give Cara her official introduction. So Cara she leads the Green Arts team. She's the Green Arts Manager with Culture for Climate Scotland. And the Green Arts team is responsible for CCS's Arts into Climate programme of work, supporting cultural organisations, artists and makers with practical ways to address the climate crisis. And she's responsible for the team's strategic approach, as well as delivering training workshops and presentations in Scotland and beyond. And I would urge you, if you have any questions, we've a bit of Slido, some questions we're going to ask you to interact with us on the chat, but it would be really great if you do that because it makes a big difference. We want to make sure this is relevant for all of you. Okay, Cara, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Katrina, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to start just by sharing my screen. So just give me one little minute while I get my presentation up and running. So as Katrina very kindly introduced, we today will kind of cover a little recap on adaptation, what we're talking about, and really the main focus is about how we see climate adaptation and buildings in the culture sector. So just a brief reminder of who we are at Culture for Climate Scotland. So we believe that the arts and culture have an essential role in achieving the transformational change that we all need for a sustainable future. And we work on that through enabling Scotland's cultural sector to understand the impacts of climate change and how we can contribute to mitigation and adaptation efforts. Of course, we also work internationally and with partners such as yourselves. So it's great to be here today. We develop new connections between non-cultural actors and arts organisations and artists, so embedding creative methods that can then help to address the climate crisis as well. We need expertise, research and advocacy to bring about sustainable change. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, I'll give you that brief reminder of what adaptation is. We'll have a look at how buildings are likely to be impacted by climate change and climate change impacts. We can provide some steps and a couple of resources for you to ensure your building is resilient and how you future, and then also finishing up with some case studies of how cultural organisations have adapted and plan to adapt their buildings. So beginning with that just brief overview of what climate adaptation is, what we mean. Climate adaptation is really about acknowledging that climate change is already happening. We're already feeling the impacts to a point, and that we need to be prepared for the changes that we've already caused. So it doesn't mean that we're not doing mitigation, we're not reducing emissions. It just means that we are acknowledging that the climate is changing and we will see more impacts. It's not one thing. It involves us preparing for both extreme weather and more gradual changes, such as when growing seasons start and end. Of course, we can't ignore that we're all linked in with these wider ecosystems all of the time in all of our activities. And really that adaptation is about this. Just briefly touching on that distinction between mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation being any action that reduces or prevents greenhouse gas emissions, adaptation being how we address climate impacts in our work, and acknowledging that sometimes there is a bit of an overlap. So to give clear examples of which one is which, mitigation might be an example like introducing more sustainable transportation, by which we might mean lower or energy efficiency factors, energy efficiency measures in our buildings. Those would be mitigation actions, whereas on the adaptation side, we might have things like emergency management or flood risk, flood protection management. And those more kind of heat management as well would fit under that adaptation side. And then you might see some actions in the middle, things like water conservation, which would have benefits for both mitigation and adaptation. So really kind of understanding that those things go alongside each other and often interact. In terms of why we need to adapt in the Irish context in particular, we can see that in Ireland, we're more likely to see more intense rainfall, water shortages in summer, increasing average temperatures, and more intense storms and winds, as well as rising sea levels. So those are the kind of actual climate impacts we can expect in the coming, well as that overarching change in distribution and what we call phenology. So that's the timing of life cycle events, so of plant and animal species on land and in the oceans, which then might impact things like food supply or the kind of availability of different resources for industry as well. So I'm going to briefly pass to Katrina, I think, just to tell us a little bit more about that side of
Yeah, I just
things.
thought, yeah, just in terms of just making sure that that Irish context is still there. And this is a report that just came out yesterday, I think, and it shows some of the barriers that are there. So there is, there's a growing awareness that adaptation is incredibly important, but that there are a lot of challenges. So there's this is covered widely in various news outlets, with the barriers to investment in climate adaptation explored in a new joint report by the Climate Change Advisory Council. So that's the body that has kind of oversight over what the people who kind of give them a scorecard annually and tell them, you're doing well in these areas and you're falling short on other areas. And we're generally, unfortunately, falling short. But they just warned that the deployment of climate, along with the central bank, the deployment of climate adaptation finance is below what is required to address the escalating risks posed by climate change. And without action, the impact of extreme weather events will test Ireland's economic and financial resilience. I know that sounds kind of dark, but it's important that that awareness is there, that the Climate Change Advisory Council is flagging that, and that we're all aware as a state that these are things that need to be addressed. We need to ramp up the attention that's given to physical adaptation. Thanks, Cara.
Yeah, excellent. And so we'd like just to get a bit of a flavour. Katrina's going to maybe help me out with this a little bit, because we know that there's quite a big difference in the kinds of buildings that we have in Scotland, things that you use for culture in Ireland. And so we'd really appreciate it if folks could pop into the chat the kind of buildings that you're working in and that you use. So maybe thinking about when those buildings were built, if they're renovated or if they're purpose built, just to give us
And
an
maybe if
idea.
you're not actually managing a building, maybe if you're thinking of a building that you use regularly, or even a building that you have used, because as Caro says, there is a big difference. Well, it's not enormous, but there definitely are more. There are a lot of older buildings in, particularly in Edinburgh, places like that. Whereas Ireland has a solid chunk of fairly contemporary art centres that were built sort of since the 1990s, as well as then Sheila's saying there, an old church building. So that's also quite common, that you get an old church building or a courthouse that's been converted. Different challenges when it comes to adapting. Ironically, older buildings sometimes cope better with the heat. They cope less well with the cold. But in some of the old buildings, some of the newer buildings that I've been in, newer art centres, there's a great challenge to dealing with heat and coping with that during the summer. So yeah, so some older buildings there. Victorian former postal sorting house. Yeah, of course the Ark is purpose built.
Really full range.
American
It's a really full
Royal,
range.
of course, is, exactly. And actually, as it happens, more old buildings than newer buildings. I would say the newer buildings sometimes have more problems.
Yes. Yeah. No, quite.
But it's all,
Thank you so much.
yeah, and just to say that it's very unique, because each building will have its own challenges, depending on where it is and the kind of building that it is. But anyway, yeah, back to you, Carol.
Yeah, exactly. It's really interesting to see that full range of lots of different types of buildings from all throughout history. It's quite striking. on, I want to cover a little bit of the kind of the ways in which buildings can be affected by these climate impacts that we're seeing and by this climate change that is already happening. And these are kind of the main areas that we need to think about. That image that you can see there is of a building that's called Slateford Green. It's not a cultural building. It's in Edinburgh, and it's an eco development of residential flats. And I used to live there. And unfortunately, that image that you can see is what happened during Storm Eowyn at the beginning of this year. And this is because it's a reasonably modern build, actually. So it was just built at the beginning of the 2000s, and it was built ecologically. So it's actually quite well adapted for things. That cupola that's on top of the building is there to maximize the use of natural light, and therefore you're thinking about reducing electricity use in the building. Also improves doors. So again, thinking about that warmer climate. Unfortunately, the materials that they used not particularly resistant to these more extreme weather events that we're seeing. So this is quite an interesting example of where a building has been designed with some elements of climate impacts in mind, but maybe there's longer term, more gradual changes that are going to happen rather than some of the more extreme weather events that we're seeing. So that for me is kind of an example of this first one around degradation of construction materials or even structural integrity from this sort of extreme weather events, extreme wear and tear that they weren't really necessarily designed to withstand. And yeah, that can be both the materials and the way that they're joined together, which can then threaten structural integrity. So even though it's a residential building, I still thought it was a good example to use given my personal connection. Um, then secondly, thinking about this kind of what happens inside a building, temperatures and seeing an inability to regulate indoor temperature and humidity, which we're now seeing some of the warmest summers on record, which becomes a problem for both workers and also people using our spaces as cultural spaces. At the moment, there is currently no legal maximum temperature for workspaces. There is a legal minimum, which is 17.5 degrees C. So buildings haven't really been designed and built with with a maximum comfortable temperature in mind. So when we're thinking about how we adapt our cultural spaces, our cultural buildings, maybe that's a good starting point to think about what is comfortable and where you might expect workers to still work or where to be moving around. So really thinking about that, how we regulate our indoor temperatures. Then thirdly, thinking about water encroachment. So flooding, especially if there are less permeable surfaces that have been used, which might be in the material of the building itself or in its surrounding areas, or in areas that are more built up and therefore potentially there are less permeable surfaces there. So water encroachment, of course, the building structure itself and actually seeing water come into a building is one thing, but it's also the building systems that it might impact when it gets in. So things that such as electricity and utilities supplies, which then really knock something out and can't be used, as well as the sort of physical objects and things that might be impacted. And then lastly, just thinking about those extreme weather impacts, which mean that buildings are experiencing much more wear and tear. So they might not last as long. So you might be looking at a reduced lifetime of the building and also potentially a loss of value. So thinking about how these things are insured for and actually where the governance is in place as well. So those are kind of just a bit of an overview of those top four to kind of think about in your particular context. Then moving us on, just quickly, these different types of climate hazards. So I've kind of already alluded to it, that we can have these acute or hazards, so one-off sudden climate events, such as an extreme weather event like a storm or a flood, which causes damage to a building, which we maybe think about a bit more because they're things that are more visible to us on a day-to-day basis because it's a dramatic change. But we've also got to think about our chronic or cumulative climate hazards. So these longer term trends like hotter summers or just more rainfall overall rather than specific kind of flooding events. And so a generally hotter climate, making it difficult to maintain a comfortable indoor temperature with existing systems. And then lastly, looking at how acute hazards can become regular, which then might lead them to being termed chronic or linked with a chronic or cumulative hazard. So that's there. And I'm just going to move us on briefly to think about what that means for managing risk. So, as with any risk, we really need to consider the nature of the hazard along with the building and its exposure and vulnerability, because you could have a building that is very exposed to the weather, very exposed to extreme weather events, maybe quite an isolated location, but it maybe isn't particularly vulnerable just because of the way it's set up. So maybe it has really there's lots of shading and cooling and greenery around it that means that it's less exposed, less kind of vulnerable, but it's still quite exposed. So thinking about risk in that way of your exposure to it and your vulnerability to it, and then determining the likelihood of it and the likely impact, and therefore how we respond. You'll be familiar with risk management in other areas of your business and operations. So I would really encourage you to think about how you manage other types of risk and how managing for climate impacts can be worked into that. So how might you incorporate climate risk into your existing systems and into your existing risk management? So just as a little bit of I'm interested to find out if you have noticed any impacts on your own buildings from weather events. So that can be thinking about those longer term, more chronic, cumulative, hotter summers, warmer, colder winters, or maybe on the other side, it might be more acute weather events that you've noticed having an impact. So you should be able to join this by just turning up at slido.com and typing in that number, which is 1523550, or using the QR code. And I can see at least 3 of you have found it, so that's good. That's great. Yeah, damp walls because of rain. Interesting. So that idea of more intense rainfall. And Katrina, if you want to unmute or comment on any of these, then please do. Flooding, of course.
Yeah, I had experiences when I was working in Sheames that flooding was an issue because there was a lot of rivers that have been culverted. So that's quite common in a lot of towns where rivers have been culverted. And then when there is heavy rainfall, there's a danger that that water will rise. Increasingly, it is. I find a lot of art centres are very warm during the summer, especially the more contemporary ones, which were built with a lot of glass.
Yeah, yeah. And someone's commented the metal paneling around buildings that heats up.
Yes.
And then someone else mentioning how they prepared for rain, but actually it was warmer. So it was more about needing cooling.
Yes.
Yeah, roof leaks
Yeah.
and damp, poor heat regulation, as we've talked about, a few leaks and insurance challenges. That's, yeah, absolutely
Right.
what
So
we'd expect
there's
to
quite a
see.
bit there. Yeah. And I suppose one thing
Yeah,
we all bear in mind when you're thinking about adapting to the changes that have already is that
yeah,
we're conscious that those impacts are going to probably grow, being
yeah,
realistic about it, and therefore whatever damages you've experienced or impacts you've experienced up to now, you have to
yeah,
factor in the likelihood that those impacts are going to become more significant.
yeah, yeah. Overheating due to south-facing glass wall, absolutely classic. Yeah, and
Skylights, Brian. Wow.
yeah, melted and damaged skylights, rather like my previous residence, and water ingress. That's interesting. Yeah, a lot of flooding related.
Yes, and a lot
Um,
of leaks.
yeah, excellent.
Okay, and somebody's just
Excellent.
get some renovation done, so this is exactly the time, yeah, to think very carefully about what the future livelihoods might be. You know, that's great. It's great to get that
Yeah,
input from everybody.
yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to move us on just now. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to cover a couple of that could be useful. And the first one that I'm going to speak about is actually created by Adaptation Scotland. We'll make sure that a link to this is sent out when we send around the slides and the recording of this session. But Adaptation Scotland have produced an SME checklist. So, of course, this isn't specifically for the cultural sector, but it does just take you through these kind of main principles of what to think about when we're thinking about adaptation. And obviously, because it's for SMEs more generally, we have these different kind of themes that they've looked at, and they all begin with P, helpfully. So they do start with people. So thinking about protecting workers and customers, or in our cases, audiences, participants, etc., people that you're working with. Premises, which is really our main focus for today, whether they're owned or leased, and then products and services, so improving the resilience of what you create. Then also processes, so thinking about your business processes that surround everything that you do. And of course, place, so working with others to improve local resilience, which we'll go into in a bit more detail next part actually. But just to kind of recommend this resource, because it really is quite a useful checklist. And I wanted to give you a few examples of how it deals with premises in particular. So in terms of premises, we get these kind of main themes. And the first one on the Adaptation Scotland SME checklist is around flooding, and how we deal with flooding response. And I know there's a particular resource for Ireland around flood info. Katrina, were you going to just briefly tell us about that?
Well, I think it is a very useful resource if you haven't used it in the past, and it even tracks back through kind of historical floods and any media coverage there was. Just to say, as well as those, sort of almost technical resources, a really worthwhile thing to consider is that you might invite people, maybe audience members, local people, to have a sort of just a conversation about what are the experiences people have had, particularly older people, over the years, because in that way you're sort of drawing your local community into what you're trying to do, into acting on climate and climate adaptation. But you're also tapping into local knowledge, because we have to, I suppose, put emphasis on the fact that each building, each location is very unique and has its own unique hazards and risks. And by involving people in your community and people that you work with, you'll just get a much better sense of that, I think. And don't just think about, weather, don't just think about in terms of rain and wind, do think about heat as well, because that's very important. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So in terms of what's covered in the checklist, we're thinking about to flooding response. They talk about raising electrical items and valuables, making sure that flood barriers are in place, air brick covers, sandbags, and planning so that workers know how to respond and there are contingency plans in place. Another sort of theme that's covered within this premises section is carrying out a site walk around to identify risks and hazards. And Katrina also made that brilliant suggestion of engaging with members of the local community and audiences, which I think is especially relevant for cultural organisations. There is a climate hazards in the workplace sort of checklist to help you with that walk around, but it really just helps you kind of consider that previous experience of the space and check some physical processes of where things are already resilient. And then the next part is really about improving resilience. So this might lead to actions like improving drainage, increasing shading and green spaces for cooling, ensuring that permeable surfaces are in place to support easier drainage, and of course exploring collaborative efforts if you're in a shared building where you're either working with your own tenants or you are a tenant in a space where you're sharing a building with other organizations. Then building maintenance, as with so many things, responding to climate impacts can also, this sort of regularity and schedule and routine can be really important when it comes to buildings maintenance. It just really helps to monitor any issues, spot things early and respond. So for example, if you have loose masonry risk, checking gutters and drainage, those are the kind of things that you might see on this maintenance schedule to just really make sure that those things are caught early, and identifying if you already have that kind of thing in use, then how does it deal with climate impacts and extreme weather events? And then lastly, making sure that governance and insurance is covered. So checking how any lease addresses possible climate impacts and ensuring that insurance covers you, and that there are contingency plans in place. So I'm just going to, sorry, I'm having a little bit of a tech fail. Right, trying to move. There we are. This second, yeah, that should be fine. Oh, so moving us on. I've lost you all. Okay,
You've
I
moved
can
on to
still
the
see
slider
myself.
now. That's
That's
what we
fine.
can see, Carol.
You can still see me, presumably. I
We
had a
can,
moment of
because
thinking,
it's a Slido.
yeah,
Have you already taken any steps? That's the slide that we can
that's
see.
perfect. Yes. So maybe, yes. So just thinking about what we've just covered within that checklist, but also the kind of risks we've thought about there. Are there any steps that you maybe have already taken that may address climate adaptation? That's good that the technology continued to work without me. That's good. Um, there we go. Yeah. Okay, so exactly. So you've probably already addressed some of these things without identifying them as climate adaptation. So making sure that drains are unblocked. Absolutely
Sandbags,
appreciate.
somebody's mentioned, yeah, which is important.
Yeah, yeah, and sandbags, regular maintenance on drainage, and
There's
and
climate
excellent.
adaptation and strategic plan, which is great. Yeah.
That's really good. Yeah, and pursuing capital funds to fix leaky and cold buildings. Um, and of course, someone who's expecting a refit soon, so now is quite a good time. Um, look at that. That's great. Yeah. So it's quite interesting. Stretching tents during festival to give cover from rain and air circulation. That's quite interesting. And I know of a couple of sort of examples, more. Um, so I know, for example, at the Festival d'Avignon, they had previously been using kind of one type of marquee that was kind of closed, and that became an issue as the summers were getting hotter. And so they switched to using a different type of tent to make sure that there was more airflow and more circulation, which just made it's even when there aren't regulations in place around appropriate temperatures for work or appropriate temperatures for viewing things, it's still good to just be aware of that and make sure that everyone's comfortable when things are happening. And
And
of
even though
course,
you may not own your building, or it's owned by a landlord, it's probably no harm to think about, for example, do you have a kind of protocol in place? If the weather, is there a certain internal temperature that you feel you and your colleagues would not be happy to work in if the temperature rises above a certain point? Or how do you cope with an electricity outage? Again, nothing necessarily to do with your building, but something that gives you a bit of resilience as a staff team. So there are areas around adaptation that mightn't necessarily have to do with your building per se, but because you're in a building, as in other words, you're not responsible for the building, but you're working in it. So maybe to reflect on that as well.
yeah, definitely.
But that is
Yeah.
obviously, in terms of making actual physical changes, of course, that is a challenge because, yeah, you can't, you can only hope that your landlord might be prevailed upon to be. But where it comes to local authorities, they might have a little bit more pressure on them to make sure these buildings are more resilient and adaptive for climate because they have their own climate adaptation strategies.
Yeah, exactly. So moving us on, thank you for that participation there, provide. Um, I'd like to just briefly speak about cultural adaptations, which is a particular project that we at CCS carried out, and it actually ran from 2018 to March 2021. It was funded through the Creative Europe program, and it was really about focusing on culture's role in society's adaptation to climate change and the adaptation issues that cultural organisations themselves need to think about. So just a brief mention of the partners that we worked with. So we did work with, at the time they were called Sniffer, they're now called Virtua, and the Climate Ready Clyde project in Scotland. We partnered with Axis in Ireland to work with Codema, and then Green Track Ghent in Belgium to work with the city of Ghent local authority. Apologies for that. Then Tilt in Sweden with the city of Gothenburg local authority. So just each of these up to methodology for cultural SMEs to explore climate adaptation. And it actually led to the development of two resources. One of them is the Adapting Our Culture Toolkit, which is more about how we implement adaptation within a cultural organization, some of the things that we're talking about today. And then secondly, looking at the embedded artist methodology. When Katrina was speaking about engaging with your local community, that's one way of doing it in quite a practical way. And there's also about embedding creative methods through that engagement. So working with artists to engage with the local community, but also with policymakers and decision makers, um, in creative activities and ways of doing things creatively that then lead to that kind of more sustained change and potentially more resilient way of approaching other issues as well. So we have these two resources, and the Adapting Our Culture Toolkit kind of takes you through three processes. There's an awful lot of kind of exercises. It's workbook based resource, and it helps you understand the impacts of climate change and sort of learn about the likely impacts in your. Then secondly, thinking about how those impacts will impact your organization. So that includes considering different types of risk and how the organization sits within and contributes to the local community, as well as the creative possibilities and opportunities. And then lastly, it just helps you to identify those managerial and practical interventions and bring those together into a plan. So on our website, we have a condensed version of the toolkit, as well as a full version with the full workbook. The workbook really does take quite an organization-wide approach, and that's partly based on our experience working with cultural organizations of making sure that these things are embedded across the organization. It's just one person within the organization that's looking after all of these things. So a lot of these activities in this workbook encourage that fuller engagement. So I wanted to give you a little flavor of some of the exercises that are included. We also on our website have a little bank of examples of adaptation plans because we actually did a refresh of this resource a couple of years ago, but it's now up on our website in this refreshed way. And that meant that we were working with cultural organizations who were implementing this workbook and trying it out as we went. And then they were able to produce adaptation plans. So those are shared on our website. There's just a little bank of 4 or 5 of them, and one of them I'm going to speak about as a case study. But to just give you a bit of an overview of the type of activities that are included. So this is one of the exercises in that second part, and it encourages you to consider the different elements of your organization. So offers, freelancers and volunteers, audiences and participants, etc., and then how they might be impacted by the climate impacts that are coming. So heat and large temperature fluctuations, rainfall and flooding, storms and extreme weather. So you could change sort of elements really if it wasn't relevant to you, or there were others that were more relevant. And just kind of gives you that opportunity, a starting point for a discussion within your team, with your community and your audience as well. So that kind of helps you think about adapting your operations. And then another sort of example of this, an activity that's included within these workbooks, is one around creating an adaptation plan. And really this kind of breaks down into 3 bits really, where you already have identified the risks. So you can list those risks and then look at whether you're going to avoid, reduce or transform them, and then the action that you will take in order to do that, which then just really helps you get that adaptation plan on paper. And so that gives you a little flavour of a couple of the things that are included in that workbook. So now we're actually going to move on to give you a few kind of case studies and examples. I think I'm going to hand to Katrina for the first one, if that's okay, Katrina.
Sure. And I think that the first case study we have is an Irish one. And many of you would probably remember this happening. So this is, and thanks to Fiona Carney, who's the CEO director in the Glucksman Gallery in Cork, on the grounds of UCC, she gave me these slides and I had a good conversation with her about it. So I think it was back in 2009 where there were these really legendary floods, and the Glucksman it's quite a new building, but it was even newer then. So this is almost 16 years ago. Badly flooded. You can see how high the water had encroached into the building. And if you go to the next slide, Caro, There's a rather sad.
Working on it.
Okay. But
Yeah.
basically, for Fiona, who was the director at the time, the basement part of the gallery was where a lot of artworks were stored. And that was really, as you can see, utterly, really, everything that was in there was really badly damaged. And there she is looking rather despondent, as you would be following that. But they were fortunate, I suppose, in one sense, in that the building is owned by UCC, and they have a really strong commitment to addressing climate change and adaptation. And obviously something needed to be done. So UCC, if you go on to the next slide then, Caro, UCC and with the input of Fiona and the people working in the Glucksman and the regional architects, because the building wasn't that long finished. So if the picture on the right shows you what the Glucksman looked like before they put in this particular measure. And this is very much a physical measure, which isn't necessarily going to work for everybody, and not every organization would have the capacity to do this. But it's just to show you how they approach a kind of an embankment, a kind of concrete embankment that now keeps that water out. And that embankment doubles up as a sort of patio for their cafe. So since then, so that's 16 years ago, the water has never come near to encroaching into their building again. But obviously, the works that they hold were so valuable that it was incredibly important that the building be protected. So, when it comes to barriers against flooding and so on, the danger is that sometimes when you put a barrier up, particularly coastal barriers, that what you're doing is you're pushing the water either further down the coast or further down the river, where somebody else is going to have to cope with it. So deciding on where we put up those kind of barriers and protections is very important, I think. Back to you now, Cara. I think you've got some interesting examples from Scotland.
Indeed, yeah. Thank you, Katrina. So I wanted to give this case study from Aberdeen Performing Arts. So they're based in Aberdeen. They actually run multiple venues. So they have His Majesty's Theatre, the Lemon Tree, and also the Music Hall. So a couple of very traditional old buildings and one that's a bit newer. But they used the Adapting Our Culture toolkit to really help them identify these risks, and then to move on to kind of list the actions they're going to take. So they're one of the example adaptation plans that we have on our website. So in terms of their local risks that they identified, prolonged rainfall, contributing to localized flooding and building damage. So in terms of those risks, they were looking at the possibility of extensive damage to building fabric, which would come with a significant cost, machinery, and public transport infrastructure, which would therefore affect access. So that prolonged rainfall, really, once you unpack it, it's got quite a lot of different facets to it. With the strong and prevailing wind contributing to building damage, that also contributes to all those other factors I just talked about. So public transport infrastructure again ends up, and therefore access. And when you're a front-facing cultural organisation that wants audience through your doors, that's obviously a very big concern. Then in terms of the sort of longer term, those chronic issues of looking at sustained periods of extreme heat or sustained periods of extreme cold. So that then made them realize that one of the risks would be inability to regulate their internal temperatures, as many of you have mentioned, and again, bringing this disruption to access for their audiences and participants. In terms of what that then meant they plan to do, they are identifying key areas susceptible to flooding, and then increasing monitoring in those areas and increasing service schedule. So there isn't, at this stage, they haven't said there's a make in their venues according to this, but they obviously need to monitor those things. Provision of thermometers across the building, so a very practical thing where they can start to monitor different temperatures, which just means that then they get that better understanding of what's comfortable and what's not for the people working in the building and people accessing the building. Putting in place a maintenance and service agreement, and also prioritizing their short and medium term development and their capital works. And so there's quite practical sort of building based actions there. And you can find that adaptation plan on our website. And Aberdeen Performing Arts, they're a member of the Green Arts Initiative, and they're a very active sort of member of our networks. So if anyone did want to, or I could make that happen. my next case study is quite an interesting one because it kind of covers multiple. We're talking about both mitigation and adaptation with this. So Antobar, which I should point out is pronounced differently in Scots Gaelic to Irish. So I did check the pronunciation on Katrina's advice. So
We had a
Antobar
heated discussion about whether it was tub in Irish would be here would be tubber. So yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. so so we do have a tow bar in Scots Gaelic. And essentially they realized with their theatre and associated buildings, they were actually spending about 40% of their annual energy costs over in the winter season. And in that winter season, they were only reaching 10% of their annual audience. And that was partly due bad weather, basically, where people just weren't leaving the house, darker nights, not wanting to go out, not wanting to kind of go to the physical location of the place. So they realized that actually they would be better off kind of mothballing their buildings and touring work to homes during that winter kind of pop-up season, as they called it. So they toured work to homes, community spaces, and village halls across Mull and Iona. And that led to a carbon saving of approximately 9 tons in their energy costs. But it also was an adaptation action in that it was responding to this community feedback around struggles that they had to access the theatre buildings during those harsher and more unpredictable weather conditions in an area that is very exposed and vulnerable to climate impacts. So I wanted to give that example of that sort of mitigation and adaptation together type work. And then a very year of the Thai Kirsava Centre, which is in the Hebrides, and you'll all be familiar with the Rising Tide installation that is there. So obviously we know that sea level rise and flood risk is is a big issue here. And already they're seeing a reduced use of their basement facilities within the existing building, and they need a greater capacity and potential. There is a greater potential there for wider community engagement. So there is a proposal there through the Centre for Island Creativity for a new creative hub in Lochmaddy, which would actually be above the flood risk line with flood protection in place, because they're already acknowledging that they know that flooding is going to be a bigger issue for them into the future. So that kind of gives us some sort of case studies and practical examples of where people are either addressing it or have already addressed it and have an adaptation plan. And so Katrina and I thought it was quite important that you go away with that inspiration, but also maybe some more sort of practical and quick wins in a way. So we've got a slide here which is just around this kind of more bite-sized adaptation. So maybe things that might suit you. If you think about your building and your approach to it, there are some sort of quite simple measures that can be taken. So maybe thinking about if you are in a context where there's a lot of glare or overheating, maybe glass, that kind of situation, and adding shades and screens, even just internal standalone screens, shades, etc. Could be one measure to take. You might look at monitoring indoor temperatures and establishing appropriate working temperatures within your organisation through consultation with your staff and your audiences and participants, and also getting that understanding of flood building, whether or not you own it. So just starting to understand those kind of conditions that you're working in. So that's a sort of bite-sized approach there. So we kind of wanted to open things up here a little bit, and just to find out a little bit about what you might take away from today, so what your next steps might be. So I'd invite you to sort of pop that in the chat, or maybe yeah, or maybe please do feel free to speak, to unmute, and to kind of let us know verbally as well.
Yeah, maybe just going back to that suggestion about engaging with people locally, because I think that is the idea of maybe creating a big adaptation strategy might feel a bit overwhelming, but a nice place to start is just an informal session where you're meeting with your use the word stakeholders, some of your audience, some of the artists maybe that you work with. If you can have a sort of informal event, a cup of tea and coffee and a biscuit, and just talk about where you see the issues being, or what you see as being the impacts that are going to be most significant over time, because that sense of involving people is really, really important. But as I say, you'll also tap into some very good knowledge that other people have in your community of your building. For the final word, which is a big thank you, especially to Caro for all of that. It was a really informative presentation, and I think there's a lot from very basic to more complicated guidance that we can pick up from that. But over to you, Irma.
Yeah, just to say thank you. I found this session really interesting and hopeful as well. And it's just great to be on the call with all of you. And yeah, I'm looking forward to how this develops when we get back in. And also, as I said, I know I'm speaking more generally, but everything you can do to help us evidence what under-resourcing and the support we need for all these different issues, everything you can do to help us give that evidence is really beneficial for us. So thank you so much to Katrina, as always, and to Caro. It was really brilliant, and to Eileen for pulling it all together. Thanks a million.
And thank you to all of you for being here, because I know it's hard to squeeze that time out of your day. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.